Prepare your heart, for today God is going to speak directly to you. There are moments in life where we find ourselves caught in the crossfire, trapped between the darkness of doubt and the radiant light of hope. We face situations that relentlessly challenge our faith, making us question whether we are truly being guided by God or simply walking blindly through life, stumbling in the dark. The Christian life, in many respects, is an uncertain path, a journey undertaken by faith, where we don't always see what lies ahead. But it is precisely in those moments, in those instances of profound uncertainty, where true faith comes into play, where it truly shines. When we speak of faith, we're talking about a spiritual pilgrimage, one that isn't just about believing in something. It's about trusting fully in what we cannot see, touch, or completely understand. It's about having unwavering confidence in the unseen. Hebrews 11, that chapter overflowing with powerful testimonies, is the key to understanding how to live a genuine faith, a faith that isn't based on what we see but on what we trust. In this chapter, we discover a gallery of characters who lived by faith, men and women who, despite not seeing what was promised, trusted in God's promises with their entire being. Each of them lived their faith in difficult circumstances, wrestling with doubts, fears, and challenges. Yet they never stopped believing in the invisible. Today, as we immerse ourselves in the words of Hebrews 11, we'll see how we can apply these same principles of faith to our everyday lives. Because true faith isn't just an abstract concept. It's a way of life, a way of living with confidence and hope, even when circumstances seem to scream the opposite. Imagine the strength and resilience it took for these individuals to maintain their belief in the face of adversity. Today, I want to invite you to reflect on your own faith. Have you ever felt lost, confused, incapable of seeing beyond your problems? This chapter holds the answer. It has the key to understanding how we can live a solid faith, a faith that never surrenders. So, if you've ever wondered how to find that peace that only God can offer, stay with us. This journey isn't just about listening to ancient stories. It's about finding living and present faith in our lives today. If you feel your walk of faith is being challenged, if you believe that God's promises seem distant or difficult to reach, this message is for you. If you've ever felt your prayers aren't being heard, that your hopes are fading, stay with us. Because today, God has something to say to you. Like, subscribe, and share this message, because what we are about to see today could change the way you view faith and, therefore, your life. In a world full of distractions and constant challenges, faith can seem like an intangible concept, something difficult to grasp and even more difficult to live. Hebrews 11 verse 1 defines faith in such a profound and revealing way that it invites us to ask ourselves, are we really living by faith? Faith, as the scripture teaches us, isn't simply a belief in what we can see and understand, but a deep trust in what we don't see, in the invisible, in what we cannot touch or feel with our hands. Faith is that certainty we feel deep within our being, even when our eyes cannot see what we are waiting for. It's an internal conviction that God's promises are real, even when circumstances tell us otherwise. Living by faith isn't simply trusting when everything is going well. Living by faith is trusting when the storm breaks out and the wind seems to blow forcefully against us. But how can we trust in the invisible? How can we believe in what we cannot see or touch? It's here where the concept of faith becomes transformative. True faith isn't based on tangible evidence but on a personal relationship with a God who is faithful to his promises. Faith is like an invisible bridge that connects our heart with the heart of God. It's the confidence that he is working despite our doubts, despite our limitations. Imagine for a moment a situation in which you see no way out. You're surrounded by problems, whether in your family, at work, or in your health, and you have no idea how it will all be resolved. Fear, anxiety, and uncertainty invade your mind. What do you do in those moments? Where do you place your faith? Allow me to tell you a brief and simple story. A man named Juan had been praying for a miracle in his life, a divine intervention in his health. He had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and hope seemed to fade with each visit to the doctor. Despite the diagnoses and the uncertainty he felt, Juan decided to continue trusting. He didn't see the future clearly, but he felt in his heart that God had a purpose in the midst of his suffering. Every morning, he got up and prayed, even when the pain was intense and the news wasn't encouraging. Despite everything, he maintained his faith, knowing that although he didn't see the solution, he trusted in God's perfect plan. And one day, without him being able to understand how, the disease began to recede. The doctors were surprised, but Juan knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was the answer to his faith in the invisible. Faith isn't just about waiting for visible results. It's about walking with confidence in the midst of the uncertain. The fact of not seeing a solution doesn't mean that God isn't working. Faith is believing that God is working even when we cannot perceive it with our senses. And sometimes, that faith is what carries us through the most difficult storms of life. But living by faith isn't easy. Doubt creeps into our hearts. We question whether we have really been heard. We face the temptation to give up, to stop waiting. However, it is in those moments where our faith is tested and refined. True faith isn't a faith that crumbles at the first wind, but a faith that, although staggering, remains standing, trusting that God's purpose will be fulfilled in His perfect time. Do you have that faith? That is the question we must ask ourselves constantly. Do you have the faith that sees beyond the visible? Do you have the faith that, although you can't see the solution, you know it's on its way? Faith isn't just a momentary feeling. It's a daily decision. It's deciding to trust in God even when the winds of life shake us forcefully. The real challenge of faith isn't when everything is going well, but when everything seems to be going against us. It's easy to have faith when things are calm, but the true test of faith is when the ground under our feet seems to crumble. And it's precisely in those moments when God invites us to trust more than ever, to look beyond the circumstances and believe in His faithfulness. Faith, then, isn't something we can generate by ourselves, but a gift that God gives us. He offers us the ability to believe, to trust in what we cannot see, but that we know is there. And we are not alone on this journey of faith. The Holy Spirit accompanies us, strengthens us, guides us through the shadows, reminding us of God's promises and assuring us that He will never abandon us. Sometimes faith leads us to dark places, to moments of uncertainty and doubt, but it is precisely in those moments when faith becomes our light. True faith isn't based on what we can see but on what we trust. It's the constant walking, the confidence that God is working, even when we don't understand everything that happens. I ask you today, where is your faith? Are you willing to walk by faith without seeing everything in front of you? Are you willing to trust in the invisible? Because when you dare to do that, when you dare to trust in what you don't see, you open yourself to experiencing the transformative power of a God who is faithful to His promises. Hebrews 11 presents us with a gallery of heroes who walked by faith without seeing what was promised, but trusting fully in God. Each of these men and women left an indelible mark on the history of faith, and their stories continue to be a beacon of hope for all of us. From Abel to Rahab, each of them lived their faith in difficult circumstances, wrestling with doubts, facing persecutions and challenges, but never ceasing to trust in the God who spoke to them. Let's look at Abel, the first mentioned in this chapter. He offered God a sacrifice of the best he had, a sacrifice that reflected his genuine faith in the Lord. Through his obedience, Abel showed that faith isn't just believing in God but also giving Him the best of ourselves, even when we don't see the immediate fruit of that obedience. In a world that values what is visible and tangible, Abel reminds us that what really matters in God's eyes is the purity of our faith and our willingness to offer Him the best. Next, we have Noah, who by faith built an ark in the midst of a world that had never seen rain. Imagine the disbelief of the people around him. Noah was building a gigantic ship, not because he had proof that the rain would come, but because he trusted in the Word of God. Noah's faith challenges us to believe in what we cannot see, to obey God even when others look at us with skepticism. True faith isn't influenced by the opinions of others but remains firm in what God has promised. Then there's Abraham, the father of faith. Abraham was called to leave his home, his land, his family, and walk towards a place that God would show him. A place he didn't know, without knowing exactly what awaited him. But Abraham obeyed, and in his obedience, God made him a promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Despite the delay in the fulfillment of this promise, Abraham never lost faith. Abraham's story teaches us that faith isn't just waiting for what is promised but obeying, no matter how long it takes before it is fulfilled. Moses, another giant of faith, faced an even greater challenge. Despite being raised in the Pharaoh's court, he decided to identify with his people, the people of Israel, and confront the oppression they suffered under the Egyptian yoke. Moses not only trusted God to free his people, but he also believed that God would use him to lead the Israelites to the promised land, despite the obstacles and the disbelief of the people. Moses' faith was tested again and again, but his trust in God led him to confront the Pharaoh and to see how the sea opened so that his people could cross it dry. Rahab, a woman mentioned in this chapter, is another example of a faith that defied all expectations. As a marginalized woman known for her occupation as a prostitute, Rahab wasn't the type of person we would normally associate with a hero of faith. However, when the spies of Israel arrived in Jericho, Rahab hid them and helped them escape, trusting that the God of Israel would save them. Through her faith, Rahab not only saved the spies but was also included in the genealogy of Jesus. Her story reminds us that no matter our history or our circumstances, God can use us powerfully when we have faith in Him. Each of these stories of faith challenges us to look beyond our circumstances and to trust in God's promises, even when we don't see the immediate result. The faith of these heroes wasn't perfect, but their trust in God never wavered. They show us that true faith isn't a faith that only expects what we can see, but it's a faith that believes in the invisible, in what is promised by a faithful God who never fails. It's easy to feel that God's promises are far from us, especially when we face difficulties or when things don't go as we expected. But faith invites us to look beyond our temporary circumstances and to trust that God has a perfect plan for our lives, a plan that will be fulfilled in His due time. Just as these heroes of faith waited for what was promised without seeing it, we too are called to live with the same confidence, knowing that our lives are in the hands of a God who is faithful to His word. When we speak of faith, it is impossible not to mention Abraham, the patriarch, who has become the most representative model of obedience in faith. Abraham's story is a deeply moving story, one that invites us to reflect on the price of obedience, even when we don't understand the purpose of what God asks of us. God spoke to Abraham in a way that few of us can imagine. He asked him to leave his country, his family, and everything he knew to walk towards an unknown land, a promised land, but without specifying exactly where he was going. God told him, "Leave your land and your relatives and come to the land that I will show you." Genesis 12 verse 1. Abraham had no map, no GPS, no clue about what awaited him. He only had the promise of God, a promise that drove him to take a step of faith, without knowing exactly where it would lead him. Imagine for a moment the magnitude of what God asked of Abraham. He lived in a comfortable place, in the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, surrounded by family and friends. And suddenly, he is presented with the order to leave without knowing what the future held. Not only was he asked to leave his home, but he was promised that he would be the father of a great nation, a nation that would flourish, even though at that time he had no children, much less land to claim. Despite all the uncertainties, Abraham obeyed. In that moment, Abraham not only trusted that God would lead him to a better place but was willing to obey even when he didn't understand the why or the how. Abraham's faith wasn't just an act of believing in what God told him but of obeying, even when he didn't have all the answers. And obedience is one of the deepest characteristics of true faith. We don't always understand what God asks of us. Sometimes obedience to God may seem difficult, even irrational. Why should we wait? Why should we trust when the path isn't clear? Obedience to God isn't always about understanding but about trusting in His sovereignty and in His perfect plan. The culminating moment of Abraham's obedience came when God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, the promised son, the son who arrived after years of waiting and prayers. Isaac represented the fulfilled promise, God's answer to Abraham's faithfulness. But God asked him to sacrifice him, which seemed like a contradiction, a test of faith that overflowed the limits of human reason. Abraham, with a heart full of faith and obedience, prepared to do what God had asked. Abraham's obedience was so great that he was willing to give the most valuable thing he had, his beloved son, trusting that even if he had to sacrifice him, God had a perfect plan. This act of radical obedience is an example that all believers are called to follow. God doesn't ask us to sacrifice our children, but He asks us to give what we love most, what we value most in our lives. Obedience in faith isn't always understood, but it always brings rewards. Abraham obeyed, and God honored him in an incredible way, not only fulfilling His promise to make him the father of a great nation, but showing that his faithfulness never fails, even in the darkest moments. Abraham's faith, which is reflected in his obedience, is a challenge for us today. Are we willing to obey God even when we don't fully understand what He is asking of us? Are we willing to give what is most valuable in our lives, knowing that God has a plan much bigger than what we can see? Faith and obedience go hand in hand, and one of the greatest fruits of a true faith is the willingness to obey God, even when we don't understand the way. It's easy to follow God when the blessings are evident, when everything is going well. But the true test of faith comes when we face situations where obedience seems to cost us something big. What do you do when God asks you to make a decision that doesn't make sense? What do you do when He asks you to follow a path that seems uncertain? The answer is in our willingness to trust and obey as Abraham did. And when we obey, we discover that God always has a bigger purpose that goes beyond our understanding. Today, perhaps God is calling you to take a step of faith. Maybe He is asking you to leave behind something that is comfortable for you, something that you love, to walk towards the unknown. Don't worry about understanding all the details. Like Abraham, trust in the faithfulness of God. His plan is perfect and His purpose for your life is much bigger than you could imagine. Are you willing to obey even when you don't understand everything that God is asking of you? The story of Moses is one of the most powerful when we speak of faith and hope in the midst of tribulation. Moses lived a life full of challenges, but his faith never wavered, even in the darkest moments. In the life of Moses, we see how faith not only sustains us in moments of difficulty, but also gives us the hope that there is a divine purpose behind every trial. Moses was born in an era of oppression when the people of Israel were under the slavery of the Egyptians. From the beginning, his life was marked by challenges. He was rescued from the waters of the Nile by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the royal court. But he knew that his identity was with his people, the Hebrews. Despite the life that the palace offered him, Moses felt in his heart that he should act in favor of his own. In a moment of desperation, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and, moved by compassion, killed him. This act forced him to flee, and it was then that his true journey of faith began. Moses' life was marked by struggle, by the feeling of being trapped between two worlds, between the Egyptian culture in which he was raised and the Hebrew people whom he felt he should liberate. After fleeing, he spent years in the desert, far from his people, as a shepherd, leading a simple and apparently insignificant life. But it was in that desert where God found him, in the famous burning bush, and gave him the mission to free his people from slavery. Moses' faith at that moment was put to the test in a profound way. He not only had to face the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at that time, but he also had to deal with the doubts and skepticism of his own people. Moses wasn't just challenging an empire, he was fighting against They had to battle incredulity and a profound lack of faith in those he was meant to liberate. The very people of Israel, weary and worn down by generations of oppression, harbored deep-seated doubts. They couldn't bring themselves to trust that Moses, a man who had once been one of them but was now a stranger, could possibly fulfill the grand promises God had whispered in his ear. Music. Amidst this sea of uncertainty, Moses clung steadfastly to his faith in God. It was a faith born not of sight, but of an unwavering conviction that the Almighty would imbue him with the strength necessary to break the chains that bound his people. When Moses boldly presented his demands before the formidable Pharaoh, things took a turn for the worse. The Pharaoh, puffed up with pride and power, didn't just dismiss Moses' plea. He responded with a cruel twist of the knife, increasing the Israelites' already backbreaking workload. Instead of the promised freedom, the people found themselves sinking deeper into the mire of suffering. In that dark hour, it would have been easy for Moses to waver, to question the very foundation of his beliefs. He might have felt as though his faith was being tested beyond its breaking point. But true faith isn't measured by the smoothness of the road ahead. It's gauged by the steadfastness with which we continue to trust in God when everything seems to be crumbling around us. Throughout the series of plagues that God unleashed upon Egypt, a symphony of devastation designed to break Pharaoh's will, Moses stood firm. He maintained his unwavering trust that, in the end, God would indeed fulfill his sacred promise. Each plague, each hardship, became an opportunity for Moses to demonstrate his unshakable belief that God was in complete control, orchestrating events according to his divine plan. And finally, when the Pharaoh, his kingdom reeling from the divine onslaught, relented and let the people of Israel go, Moses led the Israelites to the edge of the Red Sea. There, before their very eyes, unfolded a miracle of such magnitude that it etched itself into the annals of history: the parting of the Red Sea. This was a testament to God's unwavering faithfulness and the unshakable hope that springs forth from genuine faith. Music. But even after this miraculous liberation, the grumbling and complaining from the Israelites didn't cease. Every time circumstances became difficult, when the path ahead seemed uncertain, they would quickly succumb to doubt, questioning God's goodness and his intentions. Music. Moses, despite the constant barrage of criticism, complaints, and resistance, never lost his faith. And that teaches us a crucial lesson. Faith doesn't guarantee an easy life, nor does it ensure that everything will unfold exactly as we anticipate. True faith is about trusting in God even when the circumstances surrounding us seem utterly impossible. It's about believing that, despite the adversity we face, He has a divine purpose and a meticulously crafted plan that stretches far beyond the limits of our understanding. Music. In our own lives, we all inevitably encounter trials and tribulations. We may not be standing face to face with a Pharaoh, but we certainly grapple with difficulties in our relationships, struggles with our health, challenges in our work, and profound spiritual battles. Music. And like Moses, we may sometimes feel as though God's promises are distant, unattainable, just beyond our grasp. But it's precisely in those moments, when everything seems to be stacked against us, that God invites us to place even greater trust in His divine plan. Faith provides us with the hope that, even if we don't see an immediate solution to our problems, God is actively working behind the scenes, clearing a path for our ultimate liberation. Perhaps today you're facing a Pharaoh in your life, a seemingly insurmountable barrier that blocks your way forward. Maybe you're staring out at a Red Sea, unsure of how you're ever going to cross it. But I want you to remember something important. Moses didn't cross the Red Sea on his own strength. He crossed it because of his unwavering faith in the power of God. Music. And just as God was with Moses, He is also with you. He will give you the faith you need to move forward, the hope to keep your gaze fixed on Him, even when everything else seems uncertain and shrouded in doubt. The story of Rahab stands as a testament to courageous faith in the midst of profound darkness, a beacon of hope that shines brightly even today. It's a story that defies our preconceived notions about what it truly means to live by faith. Rahab wasn't a woman of high social standing, nor was she known for her spotless character. In fact, her life was marked by marginalization and the scorn of society. Yet, within her story, we find an extraordinary example of faith that shatters traditional molds, a faith that doesn't depend on human perfection, but rather on a radical trust in a God who can redeem any life, no matter how broken or tarnished it may seem. Rahab lived in the fortified city of Jericho, a city that represented the last major obstacle standing between the people of Israel and their rightful inheritance, the Promised Land. Music. When the Israelite spies arrived in Jericho, tasked with gathering intelligence about the city's defenses, Rahab made a courageous decision. She hid them and helped them escape, willingly putting her own life at risk. Music. This wasn't merely an act of hospitality. It was a profound act of faith. Rahab, knowing that her city was destined for destruction at the hands of the Israelites, chose to aid the spies because she had heard tales of the power of their God, the God of Israel. She had come to the firm conclusion that He was the one true God, the sovereign Lord of all creation. The moment Rahab made that fateful decision, she was defying not only the authority of her own city, but also everything she had ever known. She was challenging the deeply ingrained norms of her society, risking the disapproval and condemnation of her friends and neighbors, and facing the very real possibility of severe punishment for harboring the enemy. Music. Yet, her faith propelled her to take this bold step, without any guarantees that her life would be spared, without any assurances that the spies would uphold their promise to protect her. Rahab had little to lose, but she had everything to gain by placing her trust in the God of Israel. Rahab's faith offers a powerful lesson for us today. We often mistakenly believe that faith is primarily found in those who lead righteous and orderly lives, those with impeccable morals and unblemished reputations. But true faith isn't based on our own perfection. It's based on our willingness to trust in the redemptive power of God, regardless of how broken or imperfect we may feel. Music. Rahab not only believed in the promises of God, but she acted in accordance with that belief, even though it placed her in grave danger. It's important to note that, despite Rahab's complicated past, she wasn't rejected by God. On the contrary, her faith was honored, and her life was transformed in ways she could never have imagined. In fact, Rahab is mentioned in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew 1 verse 5. Music, where we learn that she was the mother of Boaz, who would later become the great-grandfather of King David. Rahab's faith not only saved her life, but it connected her to the eternal purpose of God, allowing her to play a vital role in his plan of redemption for all of humanity. Rahab's story challenges us to look beyond our own limitations and past failures. God isn't constrained by our history. He sees our hearts, not our past mistakes. If you feel that your life is marred by past errors or shortcomings, look to Rahab and remember that, with faith, anything can be transformed. Faith isn't about human perfection. It's about recognizing our need for a perfect God who can save and restore any life, no matter how broken it may seem. Rahab's courageous faith also calls us to be bold in our decisions, to take daring steps when God calls us to do something that pushes us beyond our comfort zone. Have you ever felt called to do something that frightens you? Have you sensed that God is inviting you to act in a way that challenges the expectations of others, or even your own self-imposed limitations? Rahab teaches us that faith isn't just about believing. It's also about acting courageously. Music, even when we don't see all the answers. Sometimes, faith asks us to make decisions that put us at risk, to take steps that defy our understanding and human logic. Rahab's life demonstrates that, by taking those bold steps, we open the door to a divine plan that is far grander than anything we could have conceived on our own. Obedience and faith aren't simply individual acts. They can impact the destiny of future generations. Music. Rahab's faith not only saved her life, but it also became an integral part of God's divine plan for the arrival of Jesus into this world. In our daily lives, we face decisions that demand both faith and courage. Perhaps God is calling you to make a decision that scares you, to step outside of your comfort zone in order to follow what He has promised you. Like Rahab, you must trust that, even though the path ahead may seem uncertain and fraught with challenges, faith in God is always rewarded. Throughout history, God has consistently used people with complex stories and shadowed pasts to accomplish great things. Your past doesn't define your future. Music. Faith, on the contrary, possesses the power to transform what seems impossible into something glorious. Rahab, a marginalized woman, was transformed by her faith, and God used her to become an integral part of His redemptive narrative. Hebrews 11, in addition to recounting the exploits of the heroes of faith, reminds us of a fundamental truth. Faith isn't limited to what we can see in this life. It encompasses a vision of the eternal. The men and women mentioned in this chapter lived with the promise of something far grander than what they experienced in their earthly lives. Despite their struggles and tribulations, their hope was firmly anchored in the celestial city. Music, the eternal dwelling place that God has prepared for those who faithfully follow Him. The faith of these music heroes wasn't contingent upon receiving all that was promised during their lifetimes. Music, it was rooted in a complete and unwavering trust that God's promises are true, even when the fulfillment of those promises seems distant and unattainable. Abraham's life, for example, was a life of patient waiting. God promised him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, But Abraham never witnessed the complete fulfillment of that promise in his lifetime. In fact, he died without seeing the great nation that would spring forth from his lineage. Yet, he lived by faith, believing that God would keep his word, even if he didn't see it come to pass during his time on earth. The faith of these biblical heroes challenges us to live with an eternal perspective. They lived with their eyes fixed on the celestial city, knowing that what God had promised them wasn't something temporary or earthly, but something everlasting. This is the kind of faith that invites us to live our lives today with the unwavering hope that our lives aren't just a series of fleeting moments, but that we possess a hope that extends beyond death, beyond the trials and tribulations we face. Like the heroes of faith, our gaze must be fixed on the eternal, on the promise of the life that God has prepared for us. This is a powerful challenge for all of us. We often become solely focused on our daily worries, music, our immediate struggles, on what is happening here and now. But faith calls us to look beyond the temporal. Music, to cherish the hope that God is preparing something eternal for us. When the difficulties of life overwhelm us, music, we must remember that our hope isn't grounded in temporary circumstances, but in the promise of a glorious future. The verses in Hebrews 11 verses 13 to 16 tell us that these men and women of faith died in faith without having received what was promised, but having seen it from afar, greeted it, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. These heroes didn't become discouraged by not seeing all that was promised fulfilled during their lives. They knew that their lives on earth were merely a preparation for what awaited them in eternity. They lived as strangers, as pilgrims, knowing that their true homeland wasn't here, but in heaven. This eternal perspective is what empowers us to live with hope, even when circumstances, music, challenge us. Like these heroes, we are called to live as pilgrims on this earth, knowing that our true citizenship is in heaven. Faith doesn't just enable us to see what is right in front of us. It gives us the eyes to see beyond, toward the eternity that awaits us. And this fills us with hope, giving us the assurance that, even though this world is filled with difficulties and challenges, there is a coming glory that surpasses everything we could possibly experience here. Faith is what enables us to walk toward that eternal promise. It is the hope that sustains us in moments of sorrow, that gives us strength when we feel we can no longer go on. And it is that hope that invites us to look beyond what we can see with our physical eyes. Faith in the eternal helps us to persevere, to not give up, to not succumb to discouragement, because we know that the best is yet music to come. We live in a world that focuses on the temporal. Money, success, fame, immediate gratification. But faith invites us to look beyond, to set our gaze on the eternal, on what truly matters. Jesus himself reminded us that we shouldn't store up treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but rather to store up treasures in heaven, where our treasure will be secure. Matthew 6 verses 19 to 21. Sometimes, when our trials seem endless, we need to remember that our hope isn't in the circumstances we face, but in the promises of God, promises that are eternal and will never fail. The lives of these heroes of faith remind us that, even if we don't receive all that was promised in this life, we have the certainty that music, what God has prepared for us, is far greater than we can imagine. It is for this hope that we live. Faith isn't just an act of believing music, but an act of hoping. We hope in what we don't see, but we know is music coming. And it is this hope that sustains us, that propels us to keep moving forward, to live as pilgrims, trusting that the coming glory will far outweigh any temporary suffering. Today, I invite you to look toward the eternal. When the difficulties of life overwhelm you, remember that your eyes must be set on what God has promised music you, on the glory he has prepared for those who love him. Faith leads you to that hope, a hope that will never fade away. The testimony of the martyrs is one of the most powerful in the history of the Christian faith. The martyrs of faith didn't just live by deeply held beliefs. They were willing to pay the ultimate price for their fidelity to Christ, their very lives. We often think of faith as an abstract concept. Music, something that simply sustains us during difficult times. However, the faith of the martyrs was a faith that stood firm even in the face of death. Hebrews 11 speaks of some of these martyrs, those who suffered and died for their faith, without having fully received what was promised, but who maintained their hope steadfastly. In verses 35 to 40, we are presented with stories of people who, despite being persecuted, tortured, and murdered, never denied their faith. They lived with the hope of something greater, something eternal that they couldn't see, but that they knew was assured by God's promises. Music. The faith of the martyrs is not a faith that crumbles at the first obstacle. It is a faith that remains firm, even when the price of following Christ's music is exceedingly high. These men and women didn't see victory in this life. In many cases, their deaths were cruel and brutal. But despite everything, their faith didn't waver, because they knew that their hope wasn't in this life, but in the eternal life that God had promised them. One of the music's most impactful accounts of the faith of the martyrs is that of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Stephen not only proclaimed his faith boldly, but as he faced death, he prayed music for his executioners, asking God not to hold them accountable for the sin of killing him. This act of forgiveness in the midst of death is a testament to the power of true faith, a faith that not only endures suffering, but responds to hatred with love. The story of the martyrs' music challenges us to a deeper faith. In our daily lives, it is easy to live out our faith when circumstances are comfortable and favorable, but the true test of faith comes when we face persecution, opposition, or suffering. The martyrs teach us that faith isn't just a refuge in times of tranquility, music, but a force that sustains us in the darkest moments of our lives. Often, when we face difficulties, we ask ourselves why God's music allows suffering. However, the martyrs demonstrate that suffering for the sake of faith has an eternal purpose. Although their lives were cut short, their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Each of them received a crown of glory, an eternal reward that cannot be compared to the temporary suffering they experienced. The faith of the martyrs teaches us that the true reward isn't always received in this life, but in the life to come. In suffering, there is a promise of glory. In persecution, there is a hope of victory. The martyrs lived and died for this truth, that temporary suffering cannot be compared to the glory that is to come. And that is the hope that sustains us. That is the faith that calls us to live. It is easy to have faith when things are going well, but when everything seems to be falling apart, when we face difficulties that challenge our beliefs, that is when true faith shines with the greatest intensity. The martyrs show us that faith isn't a superficial belief, but a deep conviction that leads us to stand firm even when all seems lost. Like the martyrs' music, we are called to live a faith that is unaffected by circumstances. We are called to have a faith music that is strong enough to endure suffering, a faith that can forgive even in the most difficult moments, a faith that sees beyond present suffering and looks toward the coming glory. Every time we face a difficulty, we can look to the martyrs and remember that our faith is stronger than any circumstance. Their testimony challenges us to live for something greater than ourselves, to have a hope that transcends this life and connects us with the eternal. The faith that the martyrs lived, and that we too can live, is a faith that transforms, that empowers in the midst of weakness, and that allows us to see beyond the trials and difficulties music toward the eternal promise of God. In our everyday lives, we may face small sacrifices for our faith. Sometimes, being a Christian requires us to make difficult decisions, to face ridicule or misunderstanding from others, but like the martyrs, we are called to be courageous, to keep our faith firm, and to trust that, even though suffering may be part of the journey, the glory that awaits us is incomparable. The faith that challenges us to live is the same faith that sustained the martyrs in their sacrifice, a faith that believes that, even if we don't receive all that was promised in this life, the eternal reward is assured in Christ. As we consider the accounts of the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11, we cannot help but feel a profound admiration, and perhaps even a touch of disbelief. Men and women who lived without seeing the complete fulfillment of God's promises, yet walked by faith with an unshakable hope. Music. Their lives challenge us to look beyond our immediate music circumstances and to consider the broader scope of what music God is doing in our lives. But here comes the question we must all music ask ourselves. How do we live out this faith today? The faith that we see in the heroes of the Bible isn't something relegated to a distant music past. It isn't an ancient story that only has relevance for those who lived in biblical times. The faith of these men and women music should be an inspiration for us now, in the 21st century, amidst our daily struggles. Music, our jobs, our families, our anxieties, and our uncertainties. The faith that they lived remains relevant and applicable for us today. The faith of Abraham, of Moses, of Rahab, and of all the other heroes of faith calls us to live a life of trust in the unseen. To live by faith today means having the ability to see beyond what is right in front of us, to look toward the future with hope, even when the present is uncertain. To live by faith today doesn't mean living in an ideal world, but in a world where difficulties and challenges are an inevitable part of the human experience, but where we know that we are not alone. We are not walking alone. The current world presents us with many doubts. The culture that surrounds us tends to promote a life based on self-sufficiency, on the ability to see and understand everything we do. But faith, as the scriptures teach us, is not based on our ability to understand, but on our willingness to trust in God, even when we do not see the end result. This faith calls us to accept that there are things that we cannot control, that there are paths that we cannot see clearly, but that we trust that God is working at all times. Perhaps today you face challenges that seem insurmountable. Maybe your dreams have not been fulfilled, or maybe God's promise seems very distant. Maybe life has given you more reasons to doubt than to trust. And it is here where faith plays its most important role. Faith does not depend on circumstances, but on the faithfulness of God. It does not matter what we see with our physical eyes. What is important is what we trust in our heart. Faith today calls us to live with a different perspective. Calls us not to focus on what is right in front of us, but on what God is doing in the bigger picture. Faith is the conviction that even though we do not see the immediate solution, God is in control. And it is trust in His sovereignty that leads us to walk with hope, knowing that our lives are in His hands. Imagine a vast, dark ocean. You're in a small boat, waves crashing around you, visibility near zero. You can't see the shore, you can't see any other boats, and the storm rages on. Self-sufficiency tells you to panic, to try desperately to steer, to bail out the water faster than it's coming in, to rely solely on your own strength. But faith whispers a different message. Trust in the compass. Trust in the stars you can't see. Trust in the one who charted these waters long before you set sail. The heroes of faith lived with the certainty that God's promises were more real than any visible circumstance. They walked without seeing what was promised, but with the assurance that God was faithful to fulfill what He had said. So today we are called to do the same. To walk by faith, to live by faith, trusting that God's promises are true and that despite everything we may go through, He will fulfill what He has promised. This is the true essence of faith. It is not just expecting an immediate answer, but deeply trusting in the character of God, in His faithfulness, and in His perfect timing. Living by faith is walking with the certainty that even though we do not understand everything that is happening around us, there is a divine purpose that goes beyond our comprehension. So, how do we apply this faith today? The answer is simple, although challenging. We must decide to trust in what we do not see. Live with the hope that God is working in the unseen. Faith is practiced every day, in every decision, in every moment of doubt, in every difficulty. It's in choosing to believe when your bank account is empty and your resume is rejected. It's in choosing to forgive when you've been deeply wounded. It's in choosing to pray when you feel like your words are bouncing off the ceiling. Faith is not about expecting a life without problems, but about trusting that in the midst of those problems, God is with us, guiding us, sustaining us, and fulfilling His promises. Picture a tightrope walker, high above the ground, with no net below. They're not hoping there won't be wind. They're trusting in their skill, their balance, and the strength of the rope. Our faith is similar. It's not the absence of trouble, but the presence of God within the trouble. Like the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11, you too are called to live a bold faith, a faith that does not depend on visible circumstances, but on trust in a God who never fails. The faith they lived is the same faith that today invites you to live. A faith that looks beyond the temporal and clings to the eternal. Are you willing to take that step of faith today? Are you willing to trust in what you cannot see, knowing that God is faithful to His word? The Christian life is, without a doubt, a path full of challenges, but also of extraordinary promises. Throughout this journey through the heroes of faith, in Hebrews 11, we have seen powerful examples of men and women who lived by faith, trusting in God's promises despite the circumstances. We have learned that faith is not about seeing with our physical eyes, but about trusting in what we cannot see, in what has not yet been manifested, but that we know is true because it comes from a faithful God. Faith, as we have seen, is not just an act of believing in something abstract, but a living force that moves us to act, to trust, and to hope. Even when the road becomes uncertain, it is a faith that gives us the strength to persevere in the midst of the storm, that encourages us to move forward when everything seems lost. But above all, it is a faith that connects us with the eternal, with the promises that God has for us beyond this temporal world. Today, I want to challenge you to look at your life with a new perspective. Maybe you are in the middle of a struggle. Maybe you are going through a storm that makes you doubt the goodness of God or His faithfulness. But the truth is that faith does not depend on our circumstances, but on the certainty that God is working in our life, even though we cannot see it at this moment. The lives of the heroes of faith teach us that true faith is not a faith that seeks immediate answers or visible results. It is a faith that trusts that God has a purpose, even when we do not understand everything that is happening. Faith is the certainty of what we hope for, the conviction of what we do not see. And it is that faith that sustains us, strengthens us, and guides us through the darkest moments of our life. Remember that even though you do not see the answers now, that does not mean they are not coming. Faith is not always about receiving what was promised in the moment, but about living with the confidence that what God has promised will be fulfilled in His time and in His way. The lives of the heroes of faith remind us that hope is not in what we can see, but in what we trust, in what we know God has prepared for us. It is important to understand that faith is not something we can generate by ourselves. It is a gift from God, and only through Him can we live it to the fullest. It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. You can rub those sticks together until your hands bleed, but without a spark, without the right conditions, you'll never get a flame. God provides the spark of faith. We simply need to tend the flame with prayer, obedience, and trust. Like the heroes of faith, we are called to walk by faith, to trust in the invisible, and to wait with hope for what is to come. And when we decide to take that step of faith, God manifests Himself in our lives in a powerful, transformative way. If you desire to experience that true faith, I invite you to draw near to God today. He is willing to strengthen you, to guide you, and to walk with you on this journey. No matter how difficult the road, God is with you every step of the way. He's not promising a smooth ride, but He is promising to be your co-pilot, your navigator, your mechanic, and your ultimate destination. If you have ever felt alone in your walk of faith, remember that you are not alone. The Holy Spirit is with you, guiding you, strengthening you, and giving you the faith you need to keep going. Faith is the key to accessing the life that God has prepared for you. Do not let fear stop you. Take that step toward the invisible. Because when we live by faith, we not only walk towards what is promised, but we experience the peace and hope that only God can give us. Faith is not something we can generate by ourselves. It is a gift from God, and only through Him can we live it fully. The heroes of faith in Hebrews 11 have shown us a path of obedience, courage, and hope. They walked by faith, trusting in the invisible, in what was promised, even though they did not see it fulfilled in their time. Today, I invite you to apply that same faith in your life. No matter the difficulties you face, no matter how great the challenge, remember that faith is what gives us the strength to move forward. God invites you to take that step of faith, to trust in what He has promised, to walk with hope, knowing that although the circumstances seem uncertain, He is with you. Faith is not about seeing the solutions immediately, but about trusting that God has a purpose and a perfect plan for you. Today, decide to live by faith. Do not let fear stop you. Take that step toward the invisible, trusting that in the end, you will see the glory of God manifested in your life.